911, what's your emergency?
I don't know how to say this. I was cleaning out a blockage near Maple Street, and I found... Oh God, I think they're human limbs. There's a hand and a foot. They look real. You need to send someone. Please, hurry.
The worker, a middle-aged man named Carl Jenkins, had been maintaining the sewers for over 15 years and thought he'd seen it all until today. As the police rushed to the scene, questions flooded everyone's minds. Whose limbs were these? How did they end up in the town's sewer system? The late afternoon sun spread long shadows across the peaceful suburban neighborhood. Children laughed as they played hopscotch on the sidewalks, and the scent of freshly cut grass floated through the air. The residents, many of whom had lived in this peaceful area for years, greeted each other with warm smiles and casual waves. Life here was predictable and safe until today. Near the intersection of Maple and Pine Streets, a municipal truck was standing beside an open manhole. Two workers in fluorescent vests, their faces covered with sweat, strained as they struggled with a complex blockage deep in the sewer line. The problem had been ongoing, causing minor flooding on the street. What they expected to take out was a stack of leaves, twigs, or discarded garbage. What they found instead was beyond their worst nightmares. "Jesus," one of the workers muttered, his face turning pale as he stumbled back. Hanging from the jaws of the hydraulic claw was a disgusting tangle of human remains, arms and legs, pale and bloated from their time in the polluted water. His partner, equally horrified, searched for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. We need immediate police assistance at the corner of Maple and Pine. It's bad." His voice was cracking with disbelief. Within minutes, the peaceful neighborhood was disturbed by sirens as patrol cars and emergency vehicles arrived on the scene. Officers secured the border, pushing back a rapidly increasing crowd of curious and anxious residents. Detective Laura Martinez arrived with her partner, Detective Mark Harris. Both experienced investigators, they had seen their share of terrible cases, but the view before them was spine-chilling. Forensic specialists dressed up and went into the sewer, carefully gathering the remains and documenting the scene. Martinez turned to the lead forensic technician. "What are we looking at?" The technician's face was visibly nervous. "Multiple victims. Can't say how many until we get everything sorted at the lab, but this isn't just one person," Harris murmured. "In a place like this? It doesn't make sense." Martinez looked around the crowd. Faces displayed everything from shock to outright horror. Mothers clutched their children tightly, and neighbors whispered among themselves, speculating about who, or what, could be responsible for such a horrifying act. The detectives knew they had to act fast. If there was a killer among these residents, every moment counted. By early evening, the remains had been transported to the forensic lab, and officers were patrolling the neighborhood. The sewer line where the discovery had been made was connected to about 50 homes, and each of them was now a potential crime scene. Martinez and Harris began their house-to-house questioning. At the first home, an elderly couple answered the door, their faces pale. "We didn't hear or see anything unusual," the wife insisted, wringing her hands. "This is just awful. We've lived here for 30 years, and nothing like this has ever happened." Next door, a single mother of two spoke nervously, glancing at her children playing quietly in the living room. "I thought I heard something late last night," she admitted. "Like a thud. But I just assumed it was raccoons getting into the trash." Each conversation added pieces to the puzzle but no clear answers. Harris made notes as they moved from house to house. At the fifth home, a man in his 40s answered the door, his expression tight. He wore a grease-stained apron and smelled faintly of barbecue. "What's this about?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Just routine questions. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Strange noises, unfamiliar faces?" Martinez answered. The man shook his head. "Nah, everything's been pretty normal. We had a block party last weekend. Hard to believe something like this could happen here." As they walked back to the street, Harris exhaled sharply. "We're not getting much. People are scared, but no one seems to have a clue." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "But someone knows something. We just have to find the right thread to pull." Continuing their investigation, they moved on with their house-to-house inspections and eventually came across the home of Mr. and Mrs. Adisa. Mr. and Mrs. Adisa, a gentle, elderly Nigerian couple in their late 60s, have been living there for as long as anyone can remember. Mr. Adisa, a reliable and hardworking taxi driver, is known for his cheerful nature. He spends long hours on the road, picking up fares and offering polite conversation, always with a smile on his face. Mrs. Adisa, on the other hand, is more reserved. Her health has been frail for years, and she tends to stay indoors most days, knitting quietly or watching TV in the comfort of their modest home. To the neighbors, the Adisas were a harmless and sweet elderly couple. People smile when they see Mr. Adisa returning from his shifts, waving as he parks his yellow taxi near the driveway. Meanwhile, Mrs. Adisa remains a mysterious figure, her soft voice only occasionally coming from the front door when the neighbors stop by with small gifts or to chat. However, one neighbor, James, who has lived next door to the Adisas for 5 years, has begun to feel uneasy. James, a man in his mid-40s, often exchanges greetings with Mr. Adisa when he arrives home in the evenings. But something happened a few weeks ago that has been creeping in, an unsettling memory that James can't let go of. It was a warm afternoon in late September when James first noticed it. The sun was high, and the neighborhood was peaceful. James had been home, working on his yard maintenance, when he thought he heard something strange coming from Adisa's house. It was faint at first, just a low murmur of voices drifting through the walls. But as James continued to work, the sound grew more distinct. He stood frozen in his garden for a moment, straining his ears. It was a muffled man's voice, but it didn't sound like the usual discussion Mr. Adisa might have with a customer or fellow driver. There was a sense of urgency, something sharp in the tone that felt off, as though the person on the other end wasn't supposed to be there. James felt something was off. He walked toward the fence, trying to make sense of the odd situation. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement of Adisa's house, which had a small window. James leaned closer to the window but couldn't see anything. The voice continued for a few more moments before it suddenly stopped. In that silence, something else happened. James could feel the air change, like the house had suddenly become aware of his presence. His instincts told him to walk away and forget what he had just heard, but his curiosity got the better of him. He rang the Adisa's doorbell. No answer. James waited, but the door remained shut, and no one came to greet him. The muffled voice had disappeared altogether. His heart raced, and 1,000 thoughts ran through his head. Could it have been Mrs. Adisa talking to someone on the phone? Was it just the TV? Or could something else be going on? Finally, he brushed off his unease, telling himself it was nothing. Maybe the sound had been just a part of his imagination. After all, Mr. and Mrs. Adissa had always been such sweet, quiet people. Surely, there was nothing wrong. Later that evening, when Mr. Adissa arrived home from his shift, James decided to mention the odd incident, hoping to clear the air in his mind. He stood on his doorstep as Mr. Adissa parked his taxi. As the older man stepped out of the car, James greeted him with a smile, but the moment felt different. He had questions that needed answers. "Good evening, Mr. Adissa," James said, trying to sound casual. "Hope you had a good day." "Ah, yes. It was a busy day, but I'm happy to be home," Mr. Adissa replied, offering his usual warm smile. James hesitated, then decided to ask. "I don't mean to bother you, but earlier today I heard something strange from your house." It sounded like a man's voice, kind of muffled, coming from the basement. "I rang the doorbell, but no one answered." "Do you know what it might have been?" Mr. Adissa chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. "Ah, James, you must have heard my wife watching her shows too loudly. You know how she gets with her soap operas. Sometimes she forgets the volume, and it carries all over the house." James nodded, still not fully convinced. The way Mr. Adissa had brushed it off, so quickly, so smoothly, it felt rehearsed. He couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story, something his polite neighbor wasn't saying. He thanked Mr. Adissa and watched him go inside, still with that uncomfortable feeling in his gut. As days passed, James couldn't stop thinking about the voice. He had never heard Mrs. Adissa speak to anyone, not even on the rare occasions when she'd come to the door. It seemed strange that the voice could have come from her. Was there someone else down there? James kept asking himself. He had always trusted the Adissas, but now a small seed of doubt had been planted, one that he couldn't easily ignore. It had been weeks since James first heard that voice coming from the Adissas' basement, and the growing unease he had felt slowly converted into something deeper when the police arrived. It began as a simple questioning, a routine part of their investigation into some unsolved local cases, but it was soon clear that the Adissas were at the center of something far more sinister. The police had been going door to door, asking neighbors about anything unusual that had happened recently. Most of the responses were mundane, typical of any neighborhood. But when they reached James's house, they stayed a little longer. His description of hearing a muffled voice from the Adissas' basement seemed to stand out. James hesitated at first, but the growing concern he couldn't shake off pushed him to speak up. "Well, I did hear something a few weeks ago. It sounded like a man's voice, muffled, coming from the Adissas' basement. I rang their doorbell, but no one answered. The voice stopped right after, like someone knew I was there." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Are you certain about the timing? Could it have been something else, maybe just a TV or radio?" "I don't know," James replied. "It didn't sound like a TV. It was different." The officer noted the details, and his partner exchanged a look. Without another word, they thanked James and headed off to the Adissas' house. The Adissas were home when the police arrived. Mr. Adissa greeted them with his usual warm, wide smile. He didn't seem panicked to see them, just polite, perhaps a little curious as to why they were there. Mrs. Adissa, as expected, remained inside, her presence barely noticeable. "Good afternoon, Mr. Adissa," the lead officer said, his voice calm but professional. "We're conducting a routine check in the neighborhood, and we just wanted to ask a few questions." "Of course, officers," Mr. Adissa responded. "We've had some reports of unusual activity around the neighborhood, and we were hoping you could clarify a few things." We were wondering if anyone had been visiting recently or if you'd noticed anything strange." Mr. Adissa's smile didn't fade, but there was a small shift in his posture. "No, not at all. Just the usual, you know. My wife, my driving, nothing unusual." The officers exchanged glances, noting the slight unease in Mr. Adissa's expression. "May we come in and take a quick look around?" "Just to make sure everything is in order," the officer asked. Mr. Adissa hesitated. "Of course, officers." "No problem," he said, stepping aside to allow them entry. His words were polite, but there was something in the way his hands shook slightly that made the officers skeptical. The interior of the home was neat, well kept, nothing out of place. The main floors were tidy, no clutter, no obvious signs of anything unusual. Mrs. Adissa remained upstairs, and there was no sign of distress or any noise from her. The officers conducted their search slowly, moving from room to room. But as they prepared to leave, the lead officer's keen sense of smell caught something he couldn't ignore. A faint but unmistakable chemical odor was coming from a door in the back of the house. The officer stopped, turning to face Mr. Adissa. "What's through this door?" he asked. Mr. Adissa froze. "It's just the basement. Nothing down there but some old things." The officer's instincts told him there was more to it than that. "I'd like to take a look, if you don't mind," he said. There was a long pause, but the old man reluctantly nodded, and with a sigh, he led them to the door. He turned the knob, his fingers trembling slightly as he did so. The moment the door opened, the strong, chemical scent intensified, almost overpowering. The officers' faces tightened as they stepped inside. What they found in the basement was beyond anything they could have imagined. There, stacked neatly in sealed containers, were human remains, bones, wrapped in plastic, preserved in some kind of chemical solution. The room was dimly lit, but the horror was undeniable. It was as if the very walls of the basement were holding secrets that had been buried far too long. The officers stood frozen for a moment, shock and disbelief painting their faces. "Call for backup," the lead officer said. "Now." James stood at the top of the stairs, his heart racing in his chest. He could hardly process what he was seeing. Mr. Adissa, who had always seemed so kind and welcoming, was now the focus of something far darker. Within minutes, more officers arrived, securing the scene. Mr. and Mrs. Adissa were quickly arrested, their calm appearances crumbling as they were led away in handcuffs. The grim discovery in the Adissa's basement had left the neighborhood shaken, but what followed in the days after would leave the community trembling. In the dark, cold interrogation room, Mr. Adissa sat trembling in his chair. His eyes, once warm and welcoming, now held only emptiness, and his hands trembled as he stared down at the table in front of him. The officers had already gathered evidence, and the gravity of the situation was beginning to close in on him. The lead officer leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Adissa, we know what we found in your basement. We know about the remains, and we know about the chemicals. It's time to tell us the truth. Who are you working with, and why?" Mr. Adissa's lips quivered. For a long time, he didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the table. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity before, finally, he broke. His voice was barely above a whisper, raw with guilt and resignation. "It started a long time ago," he began, his voice shaking. "I was struggling to make ends meet. Driving a taxi, it doesn't pay much, you know? And I met people who trusted me. I would offer them rides, take them to places, But I didn't just take them anywhere. I brought them here. To my wife. At first, it was just to make some extra money, Mr. Adisa continued, his voice becoming more shaky as he spoke. I'd give them something in their drink to make them sleep. They didn't know what was happening. And then I brought them home, to Mrs. Adisa. She helped me. She'd help dispose of the bodies, or sometimes, we'd sell parts, for money. The officer sat back, his face hardening. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he continued, his voice cracking. I never meant for it to get so bad. But the money kept coming in. The people kept trusting me. And I couldn't stop. We kept doing it. We kept killing them. The bodies, we would dispose of them through the sewer, the ones that didn't have any use. Some parts, we sold them. Organs. They paid us well. We'd make a deal with people who wanted them. No one ever questioned it. I never thought it would get this far. The officer's hand tightened into a fist, disgust flooding his veins. This wasn't just a crime, this was a monstrous operation, built on manipulation, deceit, and bloodshed. Where's your wife? The officer asked. Mr. Adisa didn't answer immediately, his gaze slipping toward the door, as if looking for some escape that didn't exist. She's upstairs, he muttered. She doesn't want to talk. She's always been the quiet one, but she's just as guilty. It was clear now, Mrs. Adisa had been a partner, her silence masking her role in this unspeakable crime. She had helped him, assisted in the horrifying disposal of their victims. The truth, as it unfolded, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The story broke in newspapers, on TV, and across social media. Neighbors were in shock, struggling to reconcile the image of the kind, elderly couple they had known for years with the monstrous revelations of their crimes. How could it be? People whispered to each other. They were so kind, so polite. How could they be capable of such things? Those who had known the Adisas personally struggled to believe what they were hearing. Mr. Adisa, who had once been a friendly face behind the wheel of a yellow taxi, was now a cold, calculating murderer. Mrs. Adisa, the frail, quiet woman who had always kept to herself, was just as involved in the operation. How had the neighbors failed to see the signs? How had they been so blind to the truth, living next door to monsters for so long? Neighbors who had once admired the Adisas now avoided their home, unable to face the thought that such horrors had been carried out so close to their doorstep. No one could understand how the couple had kept their secret for so long, hiding behind their polite smiles and their quiet life. The once respected name of the Adisas was forever tainted, their reputation shattered beyond repair. In the courtroom, Mr. and Mrs. Adisa faced justice for their gruesome crimes. But the damage they had caused would never truly be undone. The peaceful community, due to the events that had unfolded under their noses, would never be the same. And the name Adisa, once associated with kindness, would forever be a reminder of the evil that can hide behind even the most innocent faces.